Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of flickering torchlight, musty straw floors, and food that was often more punishment than pleasure. You're standing at the edge of a medieval village where gossip drips from the lips of weary wives like honey, and every gesture is laced with silent judgment. There's a man walking past the church square. He's heavy-set, wheezing slightly as he clutches a modest loaf of barley bread. Eyes narrow, a baker's apprentice mutters under his breath. The whispers begin. He's probably a glutton, a sinner, a man without discipline. You think modern fat-shaming is bad? Try surviving in a world where being overweight wasn't just seen as unattractive, but as dangerously immoral. In a society obsessed with suffering moderation and survival, being visibly more than others made you a walking symbol of excess and corruption. And no, it wasn't about health. It wasn't even really about food. It was about power, morality, sin, envy, and a cultural fear of bodies that didn't fit into famine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere unusual, post your location and the local time. I love seeing how far this sleepy little journey reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through a medieval alley, the kind where damp stone walls weep with mildew, and the air smells faintly of cabbage smoke and unwashed wool. You're thinner than you've ever been because, well, everyone is. In a world without preservatives or supermarkets, food is seasonal, inconsistent, and often shockingly bland. You eat what grows and what doesn't kill you. And in winter, sometimes you just don't eat. So imagine in this world of scarcity, you see someone who is unmistakably fat. Not strong, muscular, or well-fed like a nobleman known for battle. No, this person is soft, round, and visibly plump. Your gut reaction is not admiration, it's suspicion. Because in your world, food is a zero-sum game. If someone is fat, it means someone else went without. Perhaps you. The Middle Ages were brutal in ways we've mostly forgotten. Famine wasn't an abstract possibility, it was routine. Crops failed with horrifying regularity. Entire villages perished during cold snaps or locust plagues. A bad harvest wasn't just an inconvenience, it could mean starvation for your children. So anyone who seemed to be getting more than their share, whether it was food money or comfort, was viewed as morally dubious. And if they were fat, that wasn't seen as random. It was evidence. It meant they were selfish. It meant they were sinful. The medieval mind saw the body as a mirror of the soul. A thin, stooped frame might suggest piety, restraint, humility. A fat body that suggested greed, laziness, gluttony, the very first of the 7 deadly sins. In a world dominated by Catholic doctrine, gluttony wasn't just frowned upon. It was spiritually dangerous. And unlike today's quietly judgmental side eyes, medieval disdain came wrapped in theology and fear. If you were fat, it wasn't just your problem, it was proof that society had failed somewhere. That sin had taken root. That you were a walking temptation or a lesson in moral decay. It didn't help that fatness was also a visible signifier of class, but in a confusing, almost contradictory way. Poor peasants were expected to be thin because they had to labor and because they had less. But rich merchants or corrupt clergy, if they were fat people, would talk. He lives on tarts and venison while children die in the snow. There was a sense that indulgence was not just wrong, it was perverse. And yet, Sometimes the same people would praise a fat lord for being generous or prosperous. It was complicated. You see, medieval views on fatness weren't just about the body. They were about what the body represented. And nothing confused people more than someone being fat, but not powerful. A fat nobody, now that was truly disturbing. Because if you weren't rich, how did you get that way? Were you stealing? Were you cursed, possessed, or worse? Were you deliberately rejecting God's commandment of restraint? You pass an alehouse now where a traveling friar is holding court. His robes are patched, but his belly strains against the fabric. A peasant snorts quietly, preaches about fasting, then eats 2 portions at the bishop's table, he whispers. Everyone chuckles, but the laughter has teeth. That friar's body is his betrayal. His sermon says humility, but his flesh says indulgence. And this double standard, the resentment of fat commoners versus grudging tolerance for rotund nobles, was never far from anyone's mind. If you were fat and poor, you were judged twice. Once for being overweight, and again for daring to carry a body that didn't match your station. Even children weren't immune to this bias. Fat children were rare, of course, but when they did appear often in wealthier families, they were seen as spoiled, overfed, undisciplined. And their mothers, well, people had opinions. A good Christian mother raised lean, obedient children. A chubby child was proof of indulgence, of a woman who fed instead of prayed. In paintings, saints are thin. Christ is thin. Mary is delicate, almost ethereal. And in early medieval art, demons are often depicted as round, grotesque, bloated creatures. Coincidence? Not likely. Artists knew exactly what they were doing. Fatness in the Middle Ages wasn't just an aesthetic issue, it was a cosmic one. You keep walking. The cobblestones beneath your feet are uneven, your toes slightly numb from the chill. A merchant waddles past you, sweating profusely despite the cold. His purse jingles with coin, and the look on his face is smug. You feel it now, that little flicker of resentment. You don't even know this man, but already your mind races. What did he do to get so fat? Does he hoard flour? Does he bribe the miller? You're not just jealous, you're suspicious. In a land where hunger haunts your dreams, a fat man is an accusation, a symbol, proof that the system is rigged, that righteousness doesn't always triumph, and that sin walks around in velvet and pork grease. You reach the chapel as the bells ring for evening prayer. You step inside. Candles flicker. The scent of beeswax mingles with damp stone. The priest begins a sermon on temperance. And in the shadows near the altar, the local baron's steward, round-faced, bored nods off quietly. Nobody says anything, but you all see him. And that's the beginning of tonight's tale. You stay for the full length of the evening prayer, your hands folded, your knees stiff from the cold stone floor. And yet your mind isn't really on the words. It's circling back again and again to the man near the altar. His face so round, his body so solid, so full, like he's swallowed the very comforts denied to you. He yawned behind a jeweled ring, and when the congregation bowed their heads, his chin doubled into a soft pillow against his neck. You wonder, was he always like this, or did he become this way when coin made it easy? In the medieval world, fatness was rarely accidental. It required access, opportunity, immunity from back-breaking labor, and perhaps more than anything else, permission. You needed the space to gain weight, the silence of others, the tolerance of your neighbors. That's what made fatness so complicated. It wasn't just a body, it was a body with a story. Outside again, the wind nips harder. You hug your cloak tighter and think of bread. just a simple loaf fresh from the oven with steam rising through its crust like incense. But tonight's dinner was pottage again. Turnips, wild herbs, a dash of last week's pork fat. Enough to fill your belly, not enough to fill your soul. And yet somewhere nearby there are men who feast, who drink spiced wine, who eat honeyed figs shipped from the south. You've never even seen a fig, but you've heard the rumors. Their pulp is soft, their sweetness shameful, a fruit that feeds the flesh and tempts the spirit. The church warned about that kind of food, not because of its nutrients, but because of what it stirred inside you. Lust, gluttony, sloth. The fattened body was said to be a kind of soft gateway to all other sins, a slow, slippery slope paved with butter and roast goose. The idea of spiritual thinness was everywhere. Monks fasted religiously not just for penance, but to cultivate what they called holy hunger. To be full was to be dulled, lulled into fleshly comfort. But hunger made you alert, vigilant, open to God's voice. There are stories of saints so thin they were nearly translucent. Saint Catherine of Siena, for example, fasted herself nearly to death. It was considered divine. A woman consumed by God's love, not earthly food. If thinness was sacred, what did that make fatness? You pass a wooden carving nailed to a post near the baker's stall. It's meant to be comic caricatured. A fat man tipping over a barrel of wine, face red, eyes wild. His mouth stretched into a foolish grin, food dribbling down his beard. Kids giggle as they pass by. It's meant to shame, of course. But it also serves another purpose, relief. In a world where so many are cold, overworked, and perpetually hungry, mocking the fat becomes its own kind of nourishment. A brief laugh at someone who has too much. Someone who in theory should be happier, but clearly isn't. There's always a lesson built in. Too much makes fools of men. The belly leads to ruin. Lean body, sharp mind. Proverbs that get passed from generation to generation, from pulpit to hearth to schoolhouse. They're not scientific, but they are persuasive. And yet there's something else underneath all this scorn. Something quieter, a different kind of discomfort. Because in truth, many peasants don't hate the fat man just because he represents sin or excess or inequality. No. Sometimes it's because they see in him what they can never have: freedom. To be fat in a time of hunger was to break the rules, to live outside of nature's limits, to escape the punishments that others couldn't avoid. That kind of freedom is unsettling. You don't just envy it, you fear it. Because deep down you know systems are fragile. A fat man in the Middle Ages was a glitch, a contradiction. And contradictions, like witches or heretics, needed to be controlled or eliminated. Even the medical texts of the day had strong opinions. The humoral theory passed down from Galen suggested that fat bodies were full of phlegm, the cold, moist humor associated with sloth, cowardice, and melancholy. A thin, dry body was more choleric or sanguine, seen as noble, energetic, quick thinking. Fatness wasn't just seen, it was diagnosed. In the leech books and herbal manuals, you'll find potions for reducing the belly, baths in nettles, tonics of vinegar and herbs. Not because they worried about cholesterol or heart health, those concepts didn't exist, but because they believed fatness threw the body out of balance. And balance was everything. A misaligned body meant a misaligned soul. It could lead to madness, to sin, to spiritual disease. So if your belly grew round, it wasn't just your belt you had to worry about. It was your place in the cosmos. You arrive now at the village square where a small crowd has gathered around a traveling performer. He's juggling turnips, doing a comedic imitation of a local nobleman, a large man with a wheezing laugh and a love for gravy. The crowd roars. Someone calls out, "Don't forget the 4 chins," another yells. "Make him trip over his belly." Even the children are shrieking with laughter. And in that moment, it feels like unity. The poor, the tired, the lean, they all share in the joke. But the laughter has shadows. It's not just fun, it's deflection. You're laughing at the fat noble so you don't cry about the hunger in your own belly. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, artists often doodled grotesque little monsters shaped like human vices. Many were fat with distended bellies, greedy eyes, comically tiny legs. The message was clear: appetite corrupts. It makes you monstrous. But not always. In some cases, artists depicted fat angels or jolly saints. Sometimes a round belly was a sign of abundance, fertility, divine generosity. The contradiction lingers like a splinter under the skin. Because the truth is, people feared fatness, but they also longed for what it represented: warmth, comfort, satisfaction, pleasure, even power. That's why festivals like Carnival flipped the rules. For one night, people were encouraged to eat, to drink, to celebrate flesh. They mocked the thin, pious types. They crowned the village fool as king, but only briefly. By morning, the rules snapped back into place. The fat went back to being symbols of disorder, temptation, weakness. And the people returned to their lentils and cold beds. As the sun begins to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the square, you pull your hood up. There's talk of snow tonight. You're not worried about staying warm. You're worried about how many days of grain you have left. And somewhere not far from here, a steward eats his second bowl of buttered millet in a warm room by the fire. And still, no one says his name aloud. Not yet. The snow begins as a soft whisper against the rooftops, barely audible at first, just a hush that filters down through the chimney smoke and the creaking timbers of old houses. You pull your cloak tighter and move toward the edge of the square, where the village begins to blur into farmland. The path is uneven, frozen in places, and your feet remember where to step only because they've walked this route so many times before. Ahead, there's a farmhouse with a thatched roof that sags under the weight of age and snow alike. The windows glow with flickering light. You know this place. It belongs to Marjorie, the widow who's known for her stubborn goats and her scalding opinions. She's lived through 3 famines, 2 lords, and 1 plague. She has a face like dried leather and hands that could wring milk from a cloud. She's sitting now by the fire telling her grandson a story. You listen just outside the door. She speaks of a man named Brother Edric, a friar who grew so round he had to pay a boy to tie his sandals. He was a greedy soul, she croaks, took bread from the poor and called it God's will. She pauses for effect. But then came the spring flood, and the mill collapsed, and Edric slipped in the mud like a greased pig in a holy robe. The boy laughs. Marjorie cackles. The story isn't just a memory, it's a warning. In the countryside, stories like this are passed around like inherited tools, careworn, sharpened with retellings. And almost always the villain is fat. Not simply because they're indulgent, but because they represent the imbalance of life. Too much food, too little humility. Too many coins, too little kindness. A body that dares to defy the struggle everyone else has to endure. In this world, moderation isn't just a virtue, it's a survival tactic. It's drilled into you from the cradle. Don't eat too fast. Don't eat too much. Don't be greedy or the saints will look away and your fields will rot. Every superstition is a tether, a reminder that appetites must be leashed. And yet there's a contradiction brewing beneath these teachings. Because not all fatness is judged equally. You remember the abbess from the hilltop convent, plump, serene, with cheeks like ripened apples. No one dared mock her. She was too wise, too connected, too holy. Her girth was seen not as gluttony, but as blessed abundance. Some whispered that she never ate, that the Lord simply filled her from within. It wasn't unusual, actually, for respected elders, especially women of station, to be described in generous, even affectionate terms. Matronly, they said. Comforting. But only when their bodies matched their role. A woman could be fat if she was nurturing, if she embodied generosity, if she gave more than she took. A woman who was fat and selfish, now that was dangerous. That's what it always came down to: exchange. In a community where everyone was tethered to everyone else, your body was a kind of social contract. If you took more than you gave, if your belly grew while your neighbors shrank, you were breaking the pact. You walk now toward the monastery walls where candlelight spills from tall, arched windows. Inside, the monks chant in Latin voices, rising and falling like slow tides. You slip around the side where the kitchen gardens lie fallow for winter. Even in the cold, the scent of dried herbs lingers, sage, thyme, remnants of summer's abundance. In the old days, monasteries were some of the only places with reliable food stores. They had orchards, granaries, beehives, even fish ponds. The monks were often better fed than the people they served. Some became fat from their routines, steady meals, minimal exertion. But the church had rules for that too. Some abbots imposed fasting days. Others shamed gluttonous brethren by assigning them humiliating tasks like serving food without touching it. In the rule of Saint Benedict, moderation was law. 1 pound of bread per day, 1 heaping of vegetables, no red meat unless you were sick. But rules bend, and so do belts. A traveling poet once joked that the monks of Cluny had bellies like wine casks and faith as soft as cheese. The joke spread far and wide. It was whispered in taverns and copied into margins. The image stuck. In medieval minds, the image of a fat monk became a paradox, a man who claimed to renounce the world, but clearly hadn't renounced seconds. A man who sang of humility while his chin devoured his collar. These contradictions weren't just noticed, they were delighted in. Because they confirmed the belief that the powerful were hypocrites. And nothing tastes sweeter than confirmation when you've been living on turnip soup. You remember, too, the old ballads sung at fairs. One in particular sticks in your mind, a tale of a fat sheriff who couldn't mount his horse during a robbery and was left flailing in a puddle while the thief vanished into the woods. The audience laughed, not because they loved the thief, but because they hated the bulge of corruption. Fatness in these tales was always the visual punchline for moral failure. But even then, something odd lingers in the margins. Because fatness also meant survival. It meant wealth. It meant you didn't labor in the fields or freeze in the hayloft. In secret, peasants envied that. Who wouldn't want a little padding during a hard winter? Who wouldn't trade sore bones for a warm belly? You head back toward the village, boots crunching over the new fallen snow. A dog barks in the distance. Somewhere a hearth is being stoked. And you can't help but wonder, if you ever grew fat, what would people say? Would they accuse you of sin, of betrayal? Would they stop sharing stories with you? Or worse, would they pretend nothing had changed while quietly moving away, making room for your shadow to grow? You pass a cart left out in the open, half covered by a cloth. Beneath it, you spot something rare, a wheel of cheese. Fat, golden, fragrant. It must be the baker's. You're tempted just for a second. Not because you're starving, not even because you love cheese, but because to have it, to take it, would feel like claiming power. You walk on, not because you're holy, but because you know that in this world, the line between hunger and judgment is perilously thin. The sun doesn't rise so much as it seeps into the world, a gray blur melting the frost from thatched roofs and casting a dull glow over the village commons. You wake early as always. Everyone does. Sleep is a luxury for people with full bellies and quiet minds, and your belly grumbled all night like a muttering priest. The dreams it brought were odd visions of banquet tables you've never seen. Voices calling you my lord as you reached for honeyed pears you've never tasted. You shake it off. Today is market day. The path to the market winds through the frozen fields, past the old gallows, past the herb woman's hut. She's already out barefoot in the snow, muttering at her chickens and scattering dried mint like a charm. She nods at you. You nod back. Her body is wiry, angular, her clothes layered with herbs and twine. No one accuses her of gluttony, but no one dares call her a saint either. She's feared, not judged. It's different. At the market, the contrast between bodies becomes impossible to ignore. Thin shoulders and hollow cheeks crowd the stalls, peasants, apprentices, young women wrapped in two small cloaks. They move like ghosts through the fog, always reaching, never quite grasping. And then there's him, the tax collector. You spot him near the candle vendor, wrapped in fur, his fingers stained with ink and grease. He laughs loudly and slaps a merchant on the back. His gut strains against his belt, and his double chin shivers when he smiles. You've never seen him carry grain. You've never seen him walk further than the village square. And yet here he is, plump and smug and powerful. People hate him, but they also fear him. His weight is part of that fear. It makes him immovable, untouchable. A body like his doesn't dodge or duck, it simply exists, like a wall or a storm or a god. There's something medieval people understood about fatness that still lingers in our bones. Fat isn't just about food, it's about control. In the case of the tax collector, his weight is more than just a result of stolen portions. It's a symbol. He can be fat because others cannot. He's not punished for it. He's rewarded. The more flesh he gathers, the more power he projects. And the more powerless everyone else feels. You watch him walk away, purchasing an entire wheel of butter with a purse that jingles like mockery. A little boy whispers to his sister, "If you get that fat, they'll put you in the stocks." She giggles. The mother hushes them both, but the warning hangs there, suspended in the air like smoke. Don't be that kind of fat. That dangerous kind. The kind that gets noticed. Because in truth, medieval society allowed fatness, but only when it served a narrative. The king could be fat. The bishop could be fat. Even the village elder might carry a few stone extra, provided he donated enough lamb to the winter stew and blessed every wedding with a smile. But once that fat stopped being convenient, once it wasn't wrapped in generosity or holiness, it became suspicious. That's why traveling bards and performers leaned so hard into body jokes. The fat fool, the bumbling noble, the greedy merchant, they weren't just funny. They were permitted targets. You could laugh at their rolls and waddles because it was safe. It was endorsed. These characters were fat not just in form, but in failure. They made poor choices. They were outsmarted. Their fatness was punishment, not privilege. But deep down, the fear remained. What if you grew fat? What would it mean? You reach the bread stall and glance at your reflection in a copper pot. Gaunt, sallow, sharp around the eyes. Not a trace of roundness. You feel safe. Invisible even. And in this world, invisibility is preferable to ridicule. But that wasn't always the case. In some corners of medieval Europe, particularly during times of abundance, fatness briefly became fashionable, especially among the nobility. In Burgundy, for example, courtly images sometimes glorified a fuller figure. A well-fed body could imply wealth, generosity, and divine favor. Portraits of noblewomen with soft cheeks and curved arms appear in illuminated manuscripts framed by gold leaf and scriptural praise. But even this came with conditions. A noble woman could be soft, but not too soft. Her flesh had to be balanced by grace, her appetite by charity, her presence by elegance. A merchant's wife who mimicked this softness too brazenly might be mocked behind her back as a glutton or a pretender. Fatness was tolerated when it signaled status with restraint, when it showed that you had enough, but not that you took too much. Medieval medicine supported this balance. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, visionary theologian and proto-nutritionist, warned against the dangers of overeating, but also cautioned against excessive thinness. Her advice: moderation in all things, even in fasting. But for commoners, moderation was rarely a choice. You ate what you had when you had it. And if by some miracle you began to grow rounder, perhaps due to a lucky marriage, a mild winter, or a position in a wealthier household, you became visible in a new way. Watched, whispered about, resented. You remember a woman like that. Maud, the brewer's daughter, just a few years older than you, with full cheeks and arms strong from hauling barrels. She was the closest thing the village had to a beauty, though no one dared say it. She worked hard. She was generous, but she was also plump. One year when grain was scarce and her father's ales stayed full-bodied, people started talking. She's fattening herself while we starve, they'd say. How does her father still have barley? The whispers grew. Then came the theft. Someone broke into the storehouse. No one confessed. Maud stopped smiling in public after that. She started wrapping herself in tighter belts. Skipping meals. The community had taken her body personally. It became a mirror they didn't want to look into anymore. You pass the candle stall now, and the seller, a thin old man with thick eyebrows and crooked fingers, waves you closer. You'll want one, he says, if the snow keeps on. You nod, hand him a coin, and tuck the stubby candle into your bag. As you leave, he calls after you. Better to be poor and bright than rich and burning. You know what he meant, and you don't. You return through the marketplace, past the tax collector's horse, past the baker's daughters, past the shepherd with frost in his beard. Your feet know the way, but your mind drifts. Fat in the Middle Ages was never just fat. It was suspicion wrapped in flesh. It was power, perversion, punishment, and privilege all at once. A body that carried too much weight carried all of society's projections. You didn't have to say a word. Your body said it for you. And right now, you're grateful your own says nothing at all. The snow thickens as you reach the edge of the village, flakes drifting down like ash from a quiet fire piling on fence posts and rooftops without urgency. It's a clean silence, soft, still, almost sacred. And yet, as you trudge along the path back toward your cottage, a different kind of heaviness settles in. Not in your limbs, but somewhere deeper. A weight made of thought, of memory, of that gnawing sense that even your body can be read like a sin. You pass the smithy. The forge is quiet now, the anvil cold. Inside, you can just make out the outline of the blacksmith himself, Broad William they call him. A man with arms like hams and a chest like a cart horse. He's not fat in the soft, dangerous way of merchants or monks. He's thick-built, functional, and so no one mocks him. His size is strength, not indulgence. It has a purpose that you've realized is the loophole. In the medieval mind, the body is never just a body. It's a tool, a sign, a story. If you're big and you're useful, if your size serves the community, then you're safe. But if your body is just there taking up space, drawing attention down without giving anything back, then the judgment creeps in like mold on damp wool. And if you're fat and idle, that's nearly a crime. You reach your door, fingers stinging as you fumble with the latch. Inside, the warmth hits you like a breath. The fire's low but alive. You add a log, nudge it with the iron poker, and listen to the crackle. Then you sit cloak still on and stare into the flames. The church taught that gluttony wasn't just overeating, it was inordinate desire for food, which meant that even thinking too much about food could be sinful. Craving meat on a Friday, sin. Dreaming of butter when you only had lard, sin. Eating to comfort yourself, sin. Fatness wasn't proof of gluttony, but it was often treated as evidence of it, even when it wasn't true. There were other causes for large bodies, of course. Some people were naturally bigger. Some had medical conditions we now understand, but the Middle Ages did not. Gout, for instance, was seen as a disease of the rich, the king's disease, because it often struck those with access to fatty meats and wine. But many other conditions were simply labeled as imbalances of the humors. Too much phlegm, not enough bile, bad blood. Fatness, like illness, was something to be corrected, or failing that, ridiculed until it shrank. You think back to a feast you once witnessed, one of the few you were ever allowed to serve at. It was the Baron's wedding, and the manor was overflowing with noise and roast meats and spiced wine that turned lips purple. You had been assigned to the far edge of the hall, ladling stew into trenchers for lesser guests. There was a man seated near the musicians, round, red-faced, clad in velvet. He laughed too loud and ate too fast. But what struck you most wasn't his body, it was the way others treated it. They watched him, not with fear or respect, but with the kind of indulgent disgust reserved for overripe fruit. A noblewoman whispered something behind a jeweled fan and giggled. A squire made a joke about needing a separate table for the man's appetite, and yet no one said anything to his face. He was rich, connected, temporarily untouchable. But when he left early, his belt loosened his gait, uneven. The room relaxed like a storm had passed. The ridicule that followed was swift and cruel and unified. You didn't laugh then. You were too busy pocketing a crust of meat pie for later. Now, as you nibble at a hard heel of bread by your fire, you wonder if he heard them. If he always heard them. If being fat in a medieval feast was like wearing a mask that everyone pretended not to see, but never stopped talking about. The line between celebration and contempt was razor thin. There were rare exceptions, of course. Saints who were heavy, matrons who were respected. But they were the outliers, the ones whose size was eclipsed by their holiness, their charity, or their tragic deaths. More often, fatness was turned into metaphor. You recall the sermons from Father Reginald, The ones where he described hell not as fire and brimstone but as excess, a place where the greedy were fed until they burst, where gluttons were force-fed spoiled food by demons with iron ladles. The imagery was vivid, sickening, memorable. You didn't forget it. Even now, you still associate indulgence with punishment, with shame. You get up, shake the crumbs from your lap, and stoke the fire again. Outside, the snow is falling harder. The kind of snow that muffles the world, turns everything white and weightless. And yet you feel heavier with every hour. You once heard someone say that fat people didn't get cold as easily, that their bodies held warmth, that they were protected. You're not sure if that's true, but tonight, part of you envies it. Not the judgment, not the stares, but the insulation, the soft armor against a world so sharp and lean. You settle into your straw mattress, listening to the wind batter the shutters. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once and then is silent. The fire crackles, then sighs. And you let yourself wonder not about food or sin or stories, but about what it would feel like to live in a body that wasn't always calculating its worth by what it consumed. Just for a moment. Then sleep creeps in, slow and soft, like snowfall on your dreams. The morning light arrives hesitantly, as though it too has grown tired of the cold. You rise slowly, your joints stiff, your breath visible in the sliver of space between your blanket and the air. There's no rush. The fire has gone out. The sky is the same grim shade of gray it was yesterday. Still, you wrap yourself in your cloak and step outside into the hush of the village awakening. Footprints from yesterday have softened beneath fresh snow, and for a brief moment, everything looks equal, flat, covered, as if the earth itself has forgotten who is rich and who is poor. But you know it hasn't. Not really. You walk toward the church. There's a special sermon today, one of the fasting days before the new moon. The entire village has been told to come. When the bell rings, they will arrive in layers of wool and nervous silence, hoping to be reminded that hunger is a virtue. Father Bertrand will take the pulpit. His voice will be stern, his warnings heavy. He has always believed that the body is a trial, not a gift, a test, a sack of temptation one must drag up the hill of salvation. His own frame is gaunt, almost skeletal. Some say he fasts more than necessary. Others whisper that he's just too proud to be seen chewing. He preaches often about gluttony, always with examples. He never names names, but everyone knows who he means. Those who take second helpings when others haven't had first, he'll say. Those whose bellies jingle when they walk. You've heard the sermons so often that the words live in your bones. But today you listen more closely, because you've started to realize something, that these sermons are less about food and more about control. That condemning fatness is a way of managing the masses. When you fear indulgence, you're easier to govern. When you equate flesh with failure, you'll punish yourself before anyone else has to. And when everyone is hungry, so one has the energy to rise up. Inside the church, the smell of wax and damp wood fills your lungs. The benches creak under the shifting weight of the crowd. Most of them are narrow-shouldered, hollow-eyed lips, chapped from winter winds. But here and there, you spot them, the exceptions. The merchant's wife with her velvet hood, the baker's son with his full cheeks, a visiting steward with a fur-lined tunic that strains at the buttons. No one stares, not directly, but the air is heavy with attention. Father Bertrand enters. He begins not with a prayer, but a story. A man once ate so much, he says, that he could no longer kneel. He grew too wide to bow before the Lord. So God sent him a fever, a wasting fever. And when his flesh melted away, only then did he remember to pray. There's a murmur. A few heads bow. But you don't. You keep your eyes on him, because the story doesn't frighten you anymore. It angers you. Not because you crave food, but because you've seen how stories like this are wielded, how they shame the body into obedience, how they turn hunger into a badge and fullness into a crime. You step outside before the sermon ends. The air feels clearer, sharper. You pass a boy playing in the snow, just a child bundled in wool, face round and red from cold and laughter. His mother watches him closely. You can see the calculation in her eyes. She wants him to be healthy, strong, but not too round, not enough to be noticed, not enough to invite judgment. Even children carry this burden. They learn early that their bodies are being watched, measured. In medieval towns, this scrutiny wasn't just social, it was legal. In some regions, laws were passed that restricted who could wear certain fabrics or colors. Sumptuary laws, they were called. A baker's wife couldn't wear silk. A merchant's apprentice couldn't wear fur. The body had to match its place. And fatness, that was the most visible status symbol of all. If you were poor and fat, you were accused of thievery, laziness, deceit. If you were rich and fat, you were mocked behind closed doors, painted in satire, whispered about in kitchens, but never confronted directly. The system protected you, for a while, because systems rot too. There was one town, you can't recall the name now, where a nobleman grew so fat that his servants had to cut new doorways for him. At first it was seen as a joke, a curiosity. But then came the bad harvest, the bread lines, the sickness, and someone carved a message into the manor gate: you eat while we vanish. He fled the next morning. No one saw him again. You wonder if that's why people hated fatness so much. Not just because it was excess, but because it was a reminder. A mirror held up to a world that kept promising fairness, but delivering famine. Fatness was evidence that the world could be better, but wasn't. You walk down a side path now toward the river. The ice along the banks has cracked in places, revealing black water beneath. You crouch down and touch the surface. Cold, sharp, honest. And you think of the people who drowned here, some by accident, some by design. The washerwoman who slipped. The merchant who slipped, conveniently. The girl who never came back after her name was whispered too many times. Bodies were always judged here, not just in size, but in story. Fat people were mocked because they couldn't hide. Their bodies betrayed them, became symbols, carried sins that weren't theirs alone. And thin people, they disappeared, blended in, suffered in silence. You rise and look across the river where trees stand like frozen sentinels. Somewhere in those woods is a small shrine to Saint Oswin the Lean. They say he once survived an entire winter on broth and prayer. A miracle, they call it. But you wonder if someone survived on abundance, would that be seen as holy or just obscene? You turn back toward the village. Your stomach growls. And for once, you don't apologize to yourself for it. You return to the village as the church bells toll once again, their dull clang rolling through the frost-heavy air like a scolding finger. The villagers spill out into the street, some solemn others whispering behind raised hoods. You catch snippets, he meant the steward, didn't he? And God sends famine for a reason. There's that same dance in their words, a mix of devotion and envy, of fear dressed up as morality. Back at the square, smoke rises from chimneys like sighs from stone mouths. It's time for the day's work to begin. For most, that means mending tools, tending fires, or feeding animals. For others, those with softer hands, it means counting coins, supervising deliveries, ensuring that the world continues to turn in their favor. You spot him again. The merchant. The one who brings in spices from the south. His tunic is fine wool, his boots stitched with imported leather. He walks with the slow, wide sway of someone who's never needed to hurry. He's not just fat, he's prosperous. Or at least that's what people say when they don't want to use the other word. No one confronts him. No one dares. But the judgments bloom in silence. Even the baker's apprentice flour smudged across his face mutters as the man passes, fat as a pope and twice as greedy. It's strange, though, because not so long ago, before the latest drought, before the plague passed through again, that merchant had been admired. His feasts were the stuff of legend. He paid for the new bell tower. He once gave away a cart of figs at midsummer. But now he's simply too much. That's the danger of abundance in an age built on scarcity. It turns quickly like milk in the sun. One day you're generous, the next you're gluttonous. There's no in-between. You make your way toward the edge of the market, where the beggars sit, wrapped in patched cloaks and stoic silence. Their bodies are lean to the point of vanishing hollow eyes, lips cracked fingers like twigs. And yet even among them, there's hierarchy. One has a slightly fuller face. A woman older with a layered shawl and a loaf of bread hidden beneath it. They don't trust her. You can see it in the way the others angle away. She has more than they do, and that alone is cause for suspicion. Her body says she survives, and survival is a crime when it's uneven. It makes you wonder if the hatred of fatness wasn't just about gluttony or sin, but about visibility. In the medieval world, suffering was supposed to be shared. You worked together. You prayed together. You hungered together. So anyone who stepped outside of that, whose body suggested they were exempt, was automatically guilty. And the body was always a confession. You remember the fresco in the old chapel, the one where demons tormented the damned. Every vice had a symbol. The liar's tongue was stretched. The thief's hands were bound. And the glutton was shown with rolls of flesh bursting through his robe, mouth open, stomach split, and spilling coins and bones alike. It wasn't subtle. Even in art, fatness was a grotesque excess. Not just of appetite, but of everything. Noise, space, pride, sin. You walk past a tailor's stall now. Bolts of cloth flutter in the breeze. The tailor himself is arguing with a customer about measurements. Your husband's grown since last winter, he says. That tunic won't fit him. The woman bristles. He's healthy. The tailor snorts. He's indulgent. The woman pays without another word, but you know she heard it. And so did the others nearby. In that one sentence, her husband has been marked not just as fat, but as flawed. It's everywhere. And yet, despite all this condemnation, fatness persists. You think of the nobility, those who feast in stone halls and walk through tapestries instead of mud. Among them, the rules shift. A portly baron might be described as jovial, a heavy duchess called majestic. Their size is woven into their power, a mark of distance from the laboring class. And as long as they don't cross certain lines, don't become ridiculous, vulgar, corpulent beyond taste, they're tolerated, celebrated even. but only so long as their largeness reinforces the existing order. A fat king is a sign of divine favor. A fat peasant is a challenge to the system. And the system doesn't like to be challenged. You cross the square toward the well. The rope is stiff from the cold, the bucket heavy with ice. As you pull, your back aches in that familiar way, proof of usefulness, of virtue. No one will accuse you of gluttony. There's nothing to accuse. But still you think about your own body, about how much space it takes up, about how others read it, measure it, judge it, interpret it. In this world, you don't get to own your body. You only rent it from society's expectations. And if you fall behind on the whispers begin. You return home slowly, candle tucked in your sleeve, bread wrapped in cloth. You pass a girl crying behind the butcher's stall. Her dress doesn't fit. She's grown, and someone made a comment. She's probably no more than 10. You don't stop. There's nothing you could say that she hasn't already heard. And as the wind picks up again, slicing through the gaps in your cloak, you realize something else. Fatness wasn't hated because it was unhealthy. It was hated because it refused to be hidden. Because in a world that praised restraint, the fat body said the quiet part out loud. It exposed the lie of shared suffering and reminded everyone that comfort was possible, just not for them. And in the Middle Ages, hope could be more dangerous than hunger. The days blur one into the next as winter tightens its grip. You measure time by the sounds, the crunch of frozen earth, the groan of timbers under snow, the distant call of a bell. Hunger becomes a constant companion, not sharp, but dull, like a worn stone in your shoe. It shapes your thoughts, your gait, your dreams. And through it all, the village watches itself, quietly, closely. Every body tells a story, and every story is judged. You're at the tavern tonight, not drinking, just working. Clearing trenchers, wiping tables, sweeping ash from the hearth. The fire is warm, the air thick with the smell of onions and old ale. Laughter floats above the clatter of wooden mugs, but there's an edge to it. Attention. At one corner table, a man laughs louder than the rest. He's big, not just round in the belly, but wide in the face, the neck, the hands. His cloak is fine trimmed in fur. His belt buckle gleams. You don't know his name. He arrived with the traders from the next town over, but already people are watching him with that mix of interest and discomfort. He's generous. He bought a round of drinks. He's telling stories long and loud, and people are listening. But underneath their smiles, you see that flicker of something else. Not quite resentment. Not quite fear. Something in between. Because he's not from here. He didn't earn his weight in your eyes. He arrived with it. Displayed it. He brought a body too large for the room. And now everyone is deciding what that means. In the Middle Ages, social mobility was nearly impossible. You were born into your station, and that was that. But every once in a while, someone defied the rule. A fat merchant, who out-earned a knight, a well-fed widow, who outlived her husband's name, a tavern keeper, who climbed the social ladder one bowl of stew at a time. And every time that happened, people didn't just question the individual. They questioned the system. And the system did not like to be questioned. That's why bodies mattered so much. Because they revealed what the mouth might never say. A fat body in a poor town was a rumor with legs. A whisper made flesh. It suggested that effort wasn't always rewarded, that virtue didn't always lead to comfort, that the rules weren't as firm as the church claimed. So that man at the table, laughing, eating, glowing with the heat of his own satisfaction, he's a disruption, a paradox, a challenge. and you can feel the room start to shift around him. Later, when the night deepens and the mugs sit empty, someone makes a joke. Not cruel, not yet, just a nudge. A comment about belt loops or chairs built for two. Laughter follows. The man smiles, but it's thinner now. The warmth has cooled. This is how it begins. The medieval world had many tools for policing the body, but the sharpest was ridicule. Not public stocks, not sermons, not sumptuary laws. Just a well-placed joke repeated enough times, whispered into enough ears, until even the one being laughed at starts to believe it. You sweep near the man's table. He's quieter now. His hand lingers near the last piece of bread. He doesn't eat it. He just looks at it. You keep moving. By morning, he'll leave. Maybe not in shame, but in silence. He'll take his coins and his stories and his large, complicated body and disappear down the frost-hardened road. And the village will be just a little lighter again. You leave the tavern long after midnight, fingers sore throat dry from the smoke. The stars are pinpricks above cold and distant. Your breath fogs the air in front of you as you walk. And you think again about the messages sewn into the fabric of this place. How poverty was worn like a badge, how hunger was proof of goodness, how size was treated as confession. In a world where thinness was common, it became the canvas for virtue. A thin woman was obedient, a thin man hardworking, a thin child blessed. Not because they were thin by choice, but because thinness was familiar, expected. But fatness, that was a break in the pattern, a rupture. And like all ruptures, it made people uncomfortable. Not all cultures of the time viewed fatness the same way, of course. In parts of the Islamic world, for instance, a fuller figure might be seen as a sign of status or even beauty. But in your corner of medieval Europe, the consensus is firm: the body must mirror the soul. And the soul, they say, should be lean, modest, restrained. You reach your doorstep, key cold in your hand, and slip inside. The room smells like ashes and rosemary. You sit, and for a moment you do nothing. Just breathe. You think about the stories you've heard: the fat noble who burst a saddle during a hunt, the widow who rolled down the hill after market day, the steward who couldn't kneel at the altar. They were never just funny. They were warnings. Don't be like them. Don't draw attention. Don't rise above your portion. Keep your hunger quiet. You lie back on your mattress and close your eyes. And somewhere in your thoughts you imagine a different world, one where fullness is seen not as failure, but as fortune, where the body isn't a battleground, where warmth isn't punished, a world where no one is laughed at for surviving. The frost lifts a little today, not much, but enough to make the air feel less like knives and more like dull needles pressing against your skin. You wake to the sound of a cart creaking through slush, its wheels slogging forward like tired hooves. Outside, the village is restless. Not frantic, just that slow-moving urgency that comes when the cold is starting to lose but hasn't quite surrendered. You walk toward the square. There's talk of a festival. The priest is calling it a day of thanksgiving for surviving the worst of the season. There will be music, bread, maybe even meat. You don't get your hopes up, but already you know what this means. When food appears, so do the eyes. Not just looking at what you're eating, but how you eat, how much, how quickly. A public meal is never just a meal, it's a test. And in the Middle Ages, few things were more dangerous than pleasure. You've seen it before. A girl takes a second bite of honey cake and suddenly the whispers start. she'll be broad by spring. A boy licks his fingers too eagerly, and the baker raises a brow. Indulgence, even for a moment, must be punished. If not out loud, then in looks, in lowered voices. The church reinforced this constantly. Feasting was allowed, but only on holy terms, and it had to be balanced by fasting, penance, confession. Every morsel of joy needed a shadow of guilt. You were allowed to eat, but not enjoy. Allowed to survive, but not thrive. You think of the saints again. They were almost always thin, emaciated, hollowed by devotion. Their bodies shrank as their souls rose. It was presented as noble, pure, proof of their detachment from the world. And the fat, they were still of the world, still tempted, still vulnerable. Their bodies betrayed them. At the edge of the square, children are stringing garlands of dried flowers. A woman hands out bread, a small loaf per household. You wait your turn. When it's passed to you, you nod politely and step away before taking a bite. Even now you feel the weight of it in your hands, the judgment it carries. You sit near the well and eat slowly, watching others. Some eat with heads down. Others tear at the bread like it might vanish. But all of them, every single one, glances around after the first mouthful, just to see who's watching, who's tallying, because everyone is tallying, even if they don't admit it. The medieval obsession with surveillance wasn't just religious, it was communal. Everyone was responsible for everyone else's morality. If your neighbor sinned, it might bring down God's wrath on the entire village. So people watched, recorded, passed judgment like salt at a meal. Fatness then wasn't just an individual issue, it was a communal offense. Because if you had more, it meant someone else had less. And fairness, real or imagined, was everything. You once heard a story told by a traveling monk about a village that accused a miller's wife of gluttony. Not because she was cruel or proud or dishonest, but because she didn't lose weight during Lent. While others thinned, she stayed round. That was enough. They called it a miracle at first, then a sign, then a curse. By Easter, her home had been burned down. The body doesn't lie, they said. But you wonder, what if it did? What if some bodies were just different? What if some people retained weight while others shriveled? What if hunger showed itself in ways no one could see? You glance down at your own hands, chapped, lean, steady. Your body speaks the accepted language. No one suspects you of indulgence, of sin. But if that changed, would you still be trusted? You think about the clothes people wear. How even now, in layers and shawls and thick woven tunics, they try to shape the way they're seen. Belts tightened beyond comfort. Cloaks folded to hide roundness. Posture held stiff so as not to appear too soft. It's not vanity, it's survival. Even the church noticed this. Monastic rules often included dress codes meant to prevent vanity, but they were also designed to hide the body, to suppress it. Because a visible, round, abundant body was distracting, tempting, unholy. That's why art of the time often exaggerated bodies in extremes. The saint was impossibly thin, the sinner impossibly fat. There was no middle, no gray, just binary forms meant to teach, to shame, to steer. You pass a group of boys teasing a dog near the butcher's stall. One boy is rounder than the others, just slightly. A fuller face, a thicker waist. The others notice, and the jokes are small, quiet. Careful, he might eat the dog next. The boy laughs. Not easily, but he laughs. And that's how it starts. Not with cruelty, but with expectation. You know how it goes. The fat ones learn to be funny, or silent, or invisible. They make themselves useful or harmless or both. They shrink, if not in body, then in spirit. Because to be fat and proud, that's the real crime. A body that takes up space and refuses to apologize for it. Unforgivable. As the sun dips behind the hills and the shadows grow long across the square, you head home. Your stomach is full, not by much, but enough to feel noticed. You clutch your cloak tighter, and for the first time you feel the old fear settle in your chest. What if they think I've had too much, and worse still? What if they're right, but you shake the thought loose? Because you've had just enough. Because hunger is not virtue. Because fullness is not sin. At least not tonight. The night is warmer than the last. You sleep deeply without dreams, and wake to the sound of birds, thin little chirps, tentative and uncertain, like they're testing the idea of spring before committing to it. You rise slowly, your muscles aching less than usual, and stretch in the dim morning light. The village feels different today. Not better. Just softer around the edges. You dress in silence, pulling your cloak tight, and head toward the woods. You're meant to gather kindling, but really you want quiet. Out past the hedgerows and half-frozen brooks, no one watches. No one judges. Out there, your body is just a body, not a sermon, not a scandal. You follow the old path that winds behind the chapel, past the stones that mark forgotten graves. Lichen-covered names worn to whispers. Here lie those who were once measured by the same rules, how much they had, how much they took, how much space they occupied. But now they're all the same. Dust doesn't discriminate. The forest accepts you. The trees don't care if you're too lean or too round. They creak with age, drop their leaves in shameful heaps, and reach toward the sun without apology. You wonder what it would feel like to do the same, to exist without shrinking. You kneel and gather sticks. The cold bites your fingers, but you welcome it. It feels honest. You think about food, not because you're hungry, but because of what it means. How much weight a loaf of bread can carry. How easily a bowl of stew becomes a confession. How every bite is watched, counted, interpreted. Even in the woods, the memories follow. You remember a woman named Ilsa, older, round-faced, always humming. She lived alone near the river, raised geese, sold feathers and eggs. She wasn't wealthy, but she was never thin. People talked, said she must hoard food, must have charms, must steal luck from others. She was kind, generous. But when the harvest failed, they turned on her, claimed she was a witch. Not for casting spells, but for surviving when others did not. Her body made her guilty. That's the thing no one ever says aloud in times of suffering. People don't just fear fatness, they blame it. They assign it intent, as if flesh could scheme, as if roundness were a plot. Ilsa was never formally charged, but her house burned one night. She fled, or disappeared. No one knows. No one asked. Her geese scattered into the hills, and her name was left to rot in whispers. You bundle your kindling and head back slowly, heart heavy. It's not Ilsa you mourn. It's the knowledge that her story is just one of many. That for every person who grew round through chance or fortune or illness, there was a village watching, sharpening its judgments like knives. You pass a hunting party near the old oak. 3 men in fine boots, bellies thick with meat and wine. Their laughter is coarse, but no one calls them gluttons. No one dares. They're allowed to be big, because they're also loud, armed, connected. That's another rule: if your size comes with power, it's respected. If not, it's ridiculed. The line is thin and drawn by others. Back in the village, preparations for Lent have begun. The season of restraint, of fasting, of purging sin from body and soul alike. You know what this means. More sermons, more eyes, less food, but also more stories. About saints who lived on roots, about children who died thin and holy, about the fat who fell spiritually bloated into hell. It's never said outright, but you feel it how the body becomes a battleground this time of year. How every pound becomes suspicious. How clothes are watched for looseness, faces for hollowness. And if you don't shrink during Lent well, then something must be wrong. The baker's wife once said she lost 7 pounds in 40 days and gained 3 compliments and a blessing. Her husband gained nothing except sideways glances. He never lost weight, and by Easter people stopped inviting him to dinner. One day someone called him a silent glutton. He laughed it off. Then he stopped smiling altogether. It's subtle, this violence. No blood, no stalks, just isolation, whispers, distance. You walk to the well again and draw water. Your reflection ripples, then steadies. You try to see yourself clearly, try to remember what it felt like to exist before your body became public property. Maybe you never knew. Maybe no one in this village does. You pass the tavern and hear singing. Someone's already drunk. It's early, a rare indulgence perhaps. Or a warning. You don't check. You keep walking. You hear the children again, the same boys from before, the same jokes. This time they're louder. A rounder boy is being made to run. To lose that feast, they shout. Before Lent makes it holy, he runs, he laughs. But you can hear the edge in it, because he knows. They all do. In the Middle Ages, laughter is rarely kind. By midday, the bells toll again. Another death. The cobbler's wife. Thin, always sick. People say she was virtuous. She kept a holy diet, fasted, denied herself. You wonder what they'll say if you die round. You wonder if it matters. You head home. The fire is still out. You light it again and sit. And for the first time, you allow yourself a single thought, soft, dangerous, treasonous. What if having enough wasn't a sin? What if the body you live in is not your punishment? What if survival in any form is not something to be ashamed of? The wind howls again tonight, angrier than before. It rattles shutters and whistles through chimney cracks like a spirit looking for entry. You lie awake for a while, watching the fire throw its tired light across the walls, trying to ignore the gnawing at your center. Not hunger exactly. Not anymore. Something older. Something learned. In the Middle Ages, hunger wasn't just physical, it was moral. It proved you were worthy. Deserving, that you hadn't taken too much, that you weren't one of them, the soft ones, the spoiled ones, the dangerous ones. But the fire's warmth wraps around you like a memory, and for once you let yourself slip into something like rest. Morning comes with fog, thick and sour like it's hiding something. You rise slowly and walk to the edge of the village where the traveling friars have set up a stall. They do this once or twice a season, sell relics, preach a sermon, trade stories for offerings. Their robes are patched, their faces sun-worn, and they speak with the gravity of men who know how to extract guilt like blood from a wound. You stand at a distance and listen. Today's sermon is about Saint Amalda, who the friar says lived 40 years on nothing but boiled nettles and grace. He describes her body thin as birch bark, light enough to float. A miracle, he says, proof of God's love. And beware, he adds, voice rising of those who feast while others fast. Their flesh may swell in life, but it will melt in fire. You glance around. No one looks surprised. This is the world after all. You think of a man who used to live 2 villages over. They called him the ox, not because of strength, but because of size. He was a baker, kind, quiet. His bread was better than most. He added honey when he could, and shaped his loaves into roses during feast days. People liked him, until they didn't. One summer when the rains came late and the wheat spoiled, people began to notice he hadn't lost weight like the rest. His arms were still thick, his face still round. He still had butter. They began to whisper. He must be hoarding, must be stealing, must be doing something wrong. No one ever found proof, but one night his bakery burned. They said it was an accident. He never rebuilt. You carry that story with you the way you carry so many others. The way your own body carries its own tale of enough and not enough, of when you went unnoticed and when you were seen too much. Back at the square, someone's hung a new carving on the chapel wall, a cautionary image. A fat demon with a swollen belly and a chicken leg in one hand. Children laugh, mothers shake their heads. You know what it's meant to say, don't become this, but you see something else in its face. Shame, mockery disguised as morality, and fear, always fear, because fatness in this world is unpredictable. You can't always tell where it comes from. You can't always prevent it. And once it arrives, it stays, a visible defiance of discipline, a refusal to vanish. You walk away before the friars start collecting coins. You head to the orchard, what's left of it. Just bare trees, now brittle branches reaching for nothing. But in spring, this place is alive. Blush-colored blossoms, bees, the promise of sweetness. For now, though, it's just you. You sit beneath the largest tree, knees hugged to your chest, and let yourself think of the times you were hungry and proud, of the times you were full and afraid, of the night you refused a second bowl because someone might see, of the time you didn't and they did. You think of how fatness was weaponized in every story, not just as failure, but as danger, as something that spreads, corrupts, invites wrath. You once read a poem scrawled into a chapel margin. The glutton eats, the sinner grows, his body breaks his soul below. You remember how neat the letters were, how carefully they'd carved the lesson. You wonder who wrote it, and whether they still believed it as they wasted away. You rise again, brush the frost from your cloak, and begin the walk back. The path crunches underfoot, and your breath fogs in front of you like a ghost. You pass a young man barely grown tugging a cart full of kindling. His coat is tight across his chest, his arms soft, not muscle. Not yet. You hear the mutters behind him. They've started early, and he knows it, because the medieval world never waits long to begin judging. You want to say something, but what could you say that his body is not a sin, that softness is not failure, that survival is not disgrace? He wouldn't believe you, not yet. You reach your door, light the fire, Pour the last of your broth into a chipped bowl and eat. Not quickly, not quietly, not guiltily, just honestly. Because you have stopped pretending. You have survived, and that today is enough. There's a thaw in the air, barely there but real. The snow that's blanketed rooftops and fields for weeks has begun to retreat in streaks and slumps, revealing wet, flattened grass beneath. The earth smells different now, less like stone, more like something trying to wake up. You walk past the mill on your way to the river. The wheel creaks again, turning with a stutter, groaning under the weight of ice still clinging to its edges. Inside, the miller sharpens his blades. He's always been a large man, but you've noticed lately, he's become quieter, more careful with his words. He eats behind the door now, not in front of others. You understand why. Once his size was a point of pride. Strong enough to grind wheat with his knuckles, people said. But then the flour sacks grew thin. Rations began. Now his strength looks like greed. You pass without speaking. At the river's edge, the ice has fractured spiderwebs of melt cutting through the white. You crouch beside the bank and listen to the water beneath. It gurgles like a secret. And you think about how bodies are like rivers in the Middle Ages, watched when they overflow, cursed when they dry up, judged for what they carry. A woman appears on the opposite bank. You recognize her, Gerda, from the cloth dyer's family. She's wrapped in too many shawls for the mildness of the day, her posture hunched, trying to disappear. She used to be rounder. Now she's not. People used to whisper about her indulgence. Now they call her devout. It doesn't take a miracle to change public opinion. Just weight loss. Especially when it's unspoken, unexplained. People fill in the blanks. She must have fasted, must have repented, must be closer to God. But you know the truth. Her father died last winter. Her brother ran off with the guild coins. Gerda has been alone since Candlemas, and her pantry has been mostly air. She didn't get thin because of grace. She got thin because she had no choice. And now she gets praised for it. That's the cruelty of it. In the medieval world, thinness can be earned through virtue or inflicted through misfortune. But from the outside, they look the same. And fatness, that always looks like a flaw, even if it isn't. You watch Gerda walk away, her silhouette smaller than you remember, and wonder how many people she's fooled, how many people she's obliged to fool just to stay respected, just to stay invited. You return to the village as a bell rings out. Not for mass, for a marriage. People crowd the chapel steps. The bride is young, trembling eyes darting toward the ground. The groom is older, round in the way of men who've long stopped moving quickly. His belly strains against embroidered linen. His fingers are jeweled. His voice loud. And no one mocks him. Not today. Because today his weight is interpreted differently. He is wealthy, capable, a provider. Tomorrow he may be a glutton again. But today he's a husband. And the body that would normally provoke smirks now earns nods of approval. Lucky girl, someone says behind you. You're not sure if they mean it. You follow the crowd to the feast afterward. Bread, cheese, slices of dried apple, small sausages strung like rosary beads. You take your place near the wall where the guests with no titles stand. No one serves you, but you find a crust. You eat slowly, deliberately, watching the way others consume. Watching who eats freely, who nibbles under the tablecloth, who pretends to be too pious for appetite. One of the priests wipes grease from his lip and then launches into a story about Saint Maurelius, who once cured gluttony with a single touch. The sinner's belly shrank by morning, he says, laughing, and his faith grew twice as large. More laughter. You glance at the groom. He does not laugh. You wonder if he's thinking of what will be said about him tomorrow, of how quickly indulgence turns to accusation, of how wedding meat becomes penance by Lent. And you wonder too about the bride, how she'll be told to cook and to serve, to give without taking, to bear children but never let her body bear evidence of the strain, to be full of patience but empty of desire, to keep her figure modest, her meals gracious, her hunger holy. Because in the Middle Ages, women weren't just expected to feed others, they were expected to starve themselves quietly while doing it. You leave before the feast ends. You're not in the mood to see another toast raised to a body that tomorrow will be condemned. You return home with a sliver of cheese wrapped in cloth. And as the sky darkens and the village settles into the quiet scratch of sleep, you sit before your fire and think, maybe the hatred of fatness was never truly about sin. Maybe it was always about control, about ensuring that people never grew too bold, too satisfied, too aware of what comfort felt like. Because people who are content don't obey as easily, and so the medieval world made thinness into holiness, and fatness into warning. The night passes quietly. No wind, no bells, just the soft shifting of the rafters and the occasional creak of something unseen moving across the roof. You sleep better than expected. When you wake, the coals in the hearth are still faintly warm. You smile at that. Some things left alone still hold heat. You stretch your arms, roll your shoulders, and feel the bones click gently back into place. It's a market day again, the kind that draws everyone out, merchants, priests, soldiers. The type of day where the square becomes the stage and every body on it gets appraised. You know what's coming. Today there will be inspectors, not officials exactly, but guides of morality men appointed by the guild or the church to make sure traders don't sell indulgences disguised as essentials, that spices aren't laced with deceit, that cakes aren't too rich, that no one is gaining too much. They never say fat out loud, but they don't have to. You step into the square mid-morning. Already the scent of cloves and bread crust is in the air. A woman is selling boiled sweets wrapped in linen. Children stare. Mothers tug their sleeves. An old man eats a sugar fig and tries to hide it behind a cough. And then come the glances. Everyone watching everyone else. Noticing who buys, who enjoys, who finishes a whole apple tart. You pass the butcher's stall where a group of women gossip in low tones. They talk about a widow named Enid, who's been seen eating full meals again. 3 bowls of stew last week, one says, and she's barely mourning anymore. Another adds, and her arms, fuller. They don't say sin, but it's hanging in the air like smoke. You keep walking. You know that tune. The medieval obsession with the body didn't stop at appetite. It bled into every corner of life. Clothing, posture, even the pace of your walk. Too fast and you seemed anxious, greedy for your destination. Too slow and you were lazy, possibly stuffed sluggish from indulgence. Even sleep could be judged. They sleep too well, people might whisper about the wealthy. No one in pain sleeps like that. Every form of comfort became suspicious, and every sign of fatness became evidence. You stop at the herb cart where an old apothecary has laid out his wares, bundles of dried thyme, rosemary, fennel seed. He offers you a cordial. You decline, not because you don't want it, but because others are watching. He leans closer and mutters, "It helps with appetite." You pause. He means it as a kindness, maybe, or a warning. You thank him and move on. Back near the church, a tapestry hangs from the wall. It's new, the colors still bright. It shows a line of saints, their bodies tall and slender hands open in prayer. At the edge, a demon crouches, bloated, jowled, teeth bared. It holds a bone like a drumstick. Its belly touches the ground. Children are gathered in front being taught. "This is what sin looks like," the nun says, and every child nods. You remember the first time you saw an image like that. You were barely old enough to walk straight, but you remember the message. Not the words, the feeling. That fatness was not just ugly, it was dangerous. A body that overflowed became a body that corrupted. Even the language followed suit. Lean as a lamb meant innocent. Fat as a sow meant spoiled. Trim meant tidy, pure. Full meant indulgent, rotting beneath the skin. You circle back toward the alley where the weavers live. A young woman, Elsbeth, is crying near a stack of dyed cloth. She's beautiful, you've always thought. Round-cheeked, soft in the shoulders. She used to laugh without worry. But today, the laughter is gone. Someone has left a note on her door. Just 2 words, too much. You don't need to ask what it means. Neither does she. You sit beside her for a moment, offering nothing but quiet. Sometimes that's all you can give, because the hatred of fatness wasn't always loud. Often it was a whisper, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a kindness withdrawn, a silence that thickened around a person like a rope. Elsbeth wipes her eyes and returns to her loom. You rise and leave. You head home slowly. The square is full of food, but you don't stop. You don't want to be seen with a bun in your hand. Not today. Not while Enid's being watched. Not while Elsbeth's crying. Not while the tapestry is still fresh. But at your door, you pause. You reach into your pocket and pull out the fig the old man dropped near the butcher's stall. No one saw you take it. It's small, wrinkled, sugary. You eat it in one bite. And for the first time in weeks, you don't feel ashamed. You feel defiant. And in the Middle Ages, that might just be the holiest feeling of all. That evening, the sky burns with the color of old parchment, muted orange along the edges, fading quickly into soot. You light your fire before full dark comes, and listen to the familiar hush that settles over the village when people are too tired to gossip, but still too wary to rest. The cold has crept back in. It always does. You sit at the window elbows on the sill and watch the square empty out. There's a child playing near the well, spinning in circles, arms open wide. Her belly pokes from beneath her tunic. No one scolds her, not yet. She's still young enough to be called healthy, still round in the way babies are allowed to be just for a while. But you know what's coming. By next winter, someone will say she eats too much. By the one after that, she'll learn to cross her arms when she walks to hunch, just slightly, to hide what hasn't even been named yet. She'll learn that her body can be a problem before she ever understands what hunger means. You close the shutters. The church has declared another day of fasting next week. The friars say it's for penance, for protection, for peace. But you know it's because the stores are running low again, and it's easier to make starvation sound like sanctity than admit the granary's nearly bare. That's the brilliance of it, really. The medieval world didn't just enforce scarcity, it made it holy. It turned the absence of pleasure into a ladder toward heaven. And anyone who seemed content, who didn't shrink with the rest, they weren't just different. They were dangerous, because they exposed the lie. They showed that the rules weren't absolute, that maybe there was food somewhere. Maybe there was comfort. Maybe someone was hoarding it. Or maybe someone was simply unapologetic enough to enjoy it. And that made them untrustworthy. You sip your broth and remember an old tale told by a midwife, one of the few people in the village who could speak truths without punishment. She said that once there was a woman so large and soft, the very earth bent to hold her. The snow never settled on her skin. The crops grew faster where she walked. Children followed her a warmth in the dead of winter. And the villagers, afraid of her comfort, called her a witch. They sent her into exile with a sack of ashes and a curse on her name. But the next winter, nothing grew, and the children wept. You never forgot that story. Not because of the magic, but because of the fear of comfort. The refusal to let softness exist. The way the village chose to suffer together rather than allow one person to thrive. That was the real lesson. You think now about the nobility again, the ones with soft hands and heavier cheeks. How their indulgence was excused with words like refined, worldly, exalted. How they built altars and chapels and held fasts in public, only to gorge in private. And yet the villagers praised them, because fatness, when wrapped in enough gold, became invisible. It's only when it shows up in the wrong body, in the wrong house, on the wrong side of the table that people start sharpening their moral knives. You look down at your own hands. They've changed over the years. Thinner than you remember, bonier. The skin pulled tighter, but the mind no less full. You wonder if you were to grow fat, now would they notice? Would they whisper? Would they say it was grief, or sin, or selfishness? You suspect they'd say all three. You stand and stir the fire, watching as the flames flare and then settle into a soft glow. It's enough. Not roaring, but alive, like you. And you think of all the ways the world teaches you to shrink, to step aside, to laugh first before anyone can laugh at you, to pinch your waist, to pray your belt still fastens, to deny the body its simplest needs, warmth, food, ease. Because to be fat in the Middle Ages was to walk through the village with a confession carved into your flesh, even if you had nothing to confess. You sit again, cross-legged, your back against the stone wall, and you let your body be what it is. Not a sermon, not a sin, not a warning, just yours, and in this moment that feels revolutionary. The last snow falls like a final thought, quiet, half-hearted, and gone before it settles. You wake to a world already thawing the village roofs, dripping earth softening beneath your feet. The cold is retreating. But the rules haven't changed. The eyes haven't softened. You pull your cloak around your shoulders and step outside. Everything feels unfamiliar in the light, like the village itself has been caught off guard by the possibility of warmth. The baker is sweeping the steps. You see him glance at a passing girl, say something under his breath. She keeps walking. You know what he said. Not the words, but the rhythm, the tone, the shape of the insult. She's fuller now. Maybe from better luck this winter, or maybe just nature shifting as it does. But in a place like this, any softness is suspect. Even growth is scrutinized, especially in women. In the Middle Ages, a woman's body was public property. Her size wasn't just a matter of health or appearance, it was moral currency. Too thin, and she was pitiable or possibly cursed. Too round, and she was lazy, lustful, likely to distract, likely to tempt, likely to fall. And the expectations were ever-changing. If you were a wet nurse, fatness was required. If you were a nun, it was sin. If you were a nobleman's wife, it could be tolerated if paired with jewels and dowries and docility. But if you were just a woman, you had no safe shape. You walk past the chapel where the priest is hanging a new sign announcing another fast. You wonder if he believes it helps, or if he just knows it keeps people too weak to argue. Near the mill, someone is telling a story. A joke, really. About a merchant whose belly burst during a feast. It's not new. You've heard it a dozen times in a dozen versions. The merchant is always rich, always arrogant, always fat, and always punished. Because that's the arc every fat character must follow in medieval tales: excess, downfall, death. There's no redemption, no room for change. Just a simple equation: big body, big sin, big ending. You wonder who created that formula. You walk past the tavern. The stools are mostly empty, the fire low. A boy sits by the door, arms wrapped around himself. He's growing, you can tell. His face has changed, and with it the looks he receives. He was cute when he was round. Now he's being watched for it. You sit beside him, wordless. Sometimes the only kindness you can offer in a place like this is silence that doesn't judge. He glances at you, offers a half smile. You return it. You think about how deeply this place has rooted its fears in flesh, how thoroughly it's taught you that to feel full is to be spiritually empty, that to be seen is to be a threat, that your very shape can make you unholy. But the truth you've come to understand is that this fear isn't about gluttony or morality or even health. It's about control. Because fatness is visible. It can't be hidden. It takes up space. And in a society obsessed with obedience, predictability, and hierarchy, anything that takes up more than its assigned place must be made small again through shame or exile or ridicule. But here beside this boy, you begin to imagine something else. A world not built on restraint, but on respect. Not on punishment, but presence. Where bodies weren't sermons or cautionary tales, just vessels of life. You look up at the sky. The clouds are breaking. Pale blue peeks through. The kind of sky that promises a new season is truly coming. You stand, stretch, and feel the weight of your body in your feet, in your spine, in your chest. And for once, it doesn't feel like something to hide. It feels like proof. Proof that you're still here, still breathing, still yours. And now as you settle deeper into your blanket and let your breathing slow, let your thoughts begin to soften too. You've walked through a world that measured virtue in inches, holiness in hollowness, and morality in muscle. A world where fatness wasn't just a physical state, it was a suspicion, a symbol, a sentence. Where hunger was praised and fullness was feared. But you've also seen the truth beneath those whispers. You've felt the weight of stories passed down to keep people quiet, obedient, and small, not just in body, but in spirit. You've seen how fear turns softness into a threat, how laughter becomes a weapon, and how surviving becomes a scandal. Now you're somewhere safer, somewhere warm. Your body doesn't have to apologize. Your shape isn't a sermon. Here, no one is counting your portions or calculating your worth from your waist. You are simply breathing, and that's enough. Let the judgments fade. Let the stories quiet. Let your shoulders drop just a little further into the mattress. Let the warmth in the room wrap around your limbs like something earned. The world of the Middle Ages was hard, but tonight you don't have to be. Tonight you're not a symbol. You're not a warning. You're just someone falling gently into rest in a body that deserves to be here. Exactly as it is. Exactly as it's always been.